Day is basically just an introduction. So there's this short welcoming lecture, then a short introduction to cryptocurrencies, and then a short introduction to Haskell. And then on Wednesday, we'll start in earnest. So we already did the introductions. I mean, I've run this course now several times, and it used to be a live event, so in person, 2 months, and with fewer people, of course, then. So I think the most we had in the live courses was like 24. So then it was practicable to actually have every participant introduce himself or herself. But unfortunately now we are too many for that. But at least my colleagues introduced themselves. So the schedule, as Robertino already said, is somewhat fluid still. So we want to keep it interactive and reactive to be able to see how it goes and be able to adjust. But the general idea is that we have lectures 3 times a week for 3 hours each. And that in addition to that, you get assignments and projects. So regarding expectations, I mean, we have had extremely good feedback for these courses. So everybody that successfully completed it was very happy with it. But people have always also always said that it was the hardest course they ever did. So it's really quite demanding, and it's I mean, it's fast paced. It goes very far. It goes much farther than any introductory course or book about Haskell or Plutus and other Cardano things we talk about. And it's really important that you follow and that you also do the assignments. So it's in principle a full-time thing. So it's very intense and a lot of work, but hopefully also very rewarding and a lot of fun. So as I said, introductions have been made. Schedule, as I said, let me just see, right. So the idea is, I said assignments. So there is a switch after the first couple of lectures. So in the beginning, after each lecture, there will be short, easy assignments for each lecture that you must please do as soon as possible before the next lecture. And then after, I don't know, 5 or so of those, we switch to a weekly cadence. So then every week you'll get assignments and then you have a week to do them. And in addition to that, we'll also plan to do larger projects that you can work on. And as it so happens, the first 2 weeks of March, there won't be any lectures, but we hope that by then we have enough material for you to work on your first project. So then those 2 weeks you can use to work on projects and also to basically catch up with the material of the first lectures if you fell behind. Sorry. As for the assignments, I think originally we were expecting less participants, around 50. Now I think we got almost 150. So unfortunately, because I mean my team is not huge, it's impossible for us, I think, to grade 150 assignments individually. So I think you need to work in small groups, maybe 3 people or 4. I'm not sure whether you can organize that yourself or how we best do that, or whether Anderson can assist. Right, so we can see about that after this lecture maybe. So we'll try to give you feedback as soon as possible. So it's really important also that you do it and that you do it yourself. I mean, we say that all the time, and the students never listen and anyway try to copy from somebody, but you're really not doing yourself a favor, because in order to learn, you have to actively do the program and actively think about it. And also the feedback is most helpful for you if you have actually worked on the problem yourself. So that's the only way to learn a programming language, by writing as much as possible code in this programming language. Right, so today, as I already said, after this short introduction, we'll do an introduction to cryptocurrencies, just on a very high level, and then overview of Haskell. This lab setup, I mean, this is a remnant of prior incarnations of this course. Right now, the lab setup, I mean, Robertino already explained that. So it's very easy. It's basically just one click and you have a ready-made environment. So hopefully there's not much to set up. And also after today's lecture, there's already then a whole set of first assignments so that you can start coding as quickly as possible. Right, I said, I mean, this is outdated. It used to be a full-time course, 5 days a week, 8 hours basically. But as I said, 3 lectures a week. I can update the slide later. So Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And hopefully, I mean, apart from just lectures, of course, I will also try to answer your questions. I mean, you can ask your questions on the social media channels, but you can also ask them in class. And I also think it's, I mean, as the more questions there are, the more interactive it is, the better. So I don't mind being interrupted if somebody has questions. I am, however, not very multitasking capable, so I might not always see if there's a question in the chat or something, but then my colleagues can shout and then stop me. And we'll also try to, if there are like some problems with the assignments that we see people struggle with, we also take some time on Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays to go through examples and so on. And of course, we also try to present as many examples as possible. And in addition to that, I'm not sure whether there's a further slide for that. Yeah, okay, there's. So let's see. As I already said, it's important that you do the assignments. You should ask as many, I mean, a lot of questions. Robertino already said we also are very flexible. So if you have ideas, something of burning interest for you that you would like to know more about or learn about, we are open to suggestions. So the curriculum is not set in stone. Right. And yes, so this is now for these weekly assignments that I mentioned. So in the beginning, the first 1 or 2 weeks, it will be different. There will be daily assignments, or I mean, after every lecture, but then we'll switch to this weekly rhythm. And here it says 4 teams. I think we must update that. I mean, that was for a different number of participants. I would say something like 4 people, 3 or 4 people now would be good. But we can, I mean, revisit that when we get to that point in the class. Right, we'll also do very simple tests every 2 weeks, starting in, I think, next week or maybe in 2 weeks. That are really very short, that can in principle be done in half an hour. And that's just for us to see whether people are still following the lecture. Right, I already mentioned the project, so hopefully we can do the first project beginning of March. This marks 4 teams in total is again outdated. So we must see what numbers we have then and decide how big the team can be. And there you will also, I mean, it's bigger programming tasks that are hopefully a lot of fun. And then you can also, I mean, they're not completely 100% well defined. So you have room for creativity and bring in your own ideas. And then you also will get the chance to demonstrate your projects in class. I think this, let's see. I'm also not sure whether, I mean, GitHub, Discord, do we use Discord or do we use Telegram?
Last time we didn't use Discord because we were physically there the first part, and then people could answer questions in the IOG's Haskell channel.
Oh,
and we were there to answer them.
okay.
So they can go to the technical challenge. They have the links in the repository.
Okay, great. Okay, so I think we need to update this slide. It's a bit outdated. Okay, so this is basically that. That's the introduction. The
We have a
introductory
question.
slide. Yes, please, Lufefe. Do we have to? Was there a question?
Yes,
Is it-
yes,
Yeah.
you got it. Where do we get the links? I just missed it. Sorry. Don't worry. I will share the link of the repo in the chat.
Right, and in repo there are the links to all the other stuff, right? To the Slack and so on.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, are there other questions? Okay, if not, then we can jump to the first introductory lecture about cryptocurrencies. And then maybe we can have a break and then do the introduction to Haskell part. Okay, let me share again. Sorry, just 1 second before I do that. Okay, let me share. Oops. Okay, so I mean, obviously later we will become much more specific, and I mean, especially in the second half of the course when we talk about Plutus, it will be very hands-on. So this is just supposed to give a general overview over cryptocurrencies, blockchain and cryptocurrencies. So we'll talk about blockchain, cryptocurrencies, what they are and how they work, and then the relation of our company IOG to cryptocurrencies and how Haskell is related to that. Okay, so let's start with blockchains. Let's start with this Wikipedia quote. A blockchain is a distributed database that is used to maintain a continuously growing list of records called blocks. Each block contains a timestamp and a link to a previous block. So blockchains are, I mean, I always think of it as write-only memory in the cloud. So in principle, I mean, of course, there are lots of technicalities and lots of mathematics and computer science that go into actually building a blockchain. But on a like very conceptual high level, they are just decentralized write-only memory. So write-only in the sense that, I mean, you can add data to the blockchain, but you can never edit existing data or remove existing data. So in that sense, it's write-only. And in the cloud, because it's not, I mean, there's not a single point of failure. So it's decentralized. So the data is replicated over thousands of so-called nodes. And that is the whole point. So you have a very resilient, fast, reliable memory, public memory, accessible to everyone. That is write only. So ledger, I don't know whether people these days will know what a ledger is. So that used to be a book, like a big book. So in the old days, like banks, I mean, banks start as some merchant, some rich merchant sitting on a market square somewhere at the table with a big book in front of him, and then people could come to this table and deposit money, and then he would basically make an entry by hand with ink on paper to this ledger and say so and so deposited so and so many so and so much money, so and so many coins, and then or do transaction and so on. So basically everything was recorded in this ledger. And I always call blockchain a ledger in the cloud. So it's the same idea. So you have this big book with entries that are immutable. So they should never be modified or deleted ever again once they're in the ledger. But the difference to these historical origins with the guy sitting at the table on a market square is that it's decentralized over the whole world. and therefore very resilient against failure. I mean, this ledger, the book, the physical book can, of course, something can happen to it. There can be a fire, for example, and the entries can be destroyed, or it can be stolen, or whatever, water damage or something. The blockchain makes it much more secure by distributing it hundreds or thousands of times all over the world. So it's virtually impossible for the data to be lost. But the idea is still it's basically this ledger. So blockchain is like this big book where everyone can make entries into. And so blockchain makes sense wherever these ledgers make sense. And when we hear blockchain, we normally think of cryptocurrencies, or that's the first thing that comes to mind. But that's just a special case. That's a special case where the entries in this ledger are financial transactions. So an entry in the ledger would be something like Robertino sends 100 ADA to Karina, something like that. Then you get, I mean, given a ledger with such entries, you have a cryptocurrency. But it doesn't necessarily have to be financial transactions. Another example would be something like certificates, like university diplomas. So instead of printing a diploma on paper and the university having it in its archives, it can be put on the blockchain. And then it's easier for people to prove that they have certain qualifications or certificates. So this GUNet or GUNet that's mentioned there, that was an early pilot that IOG did with Greek universities. So there was a small blockchain of I think 7 so Greek universities that agreed to put diplomas on this little blockchain. And later there was we had a big collaboration with Ethiopia, the country of Ethiopia. So they are in the process of putting all their high school diplomas and high school certificates on the Cardano blockchain. And there was also, I think, a collaboration with California, with some institutions in California, universities, I think. So they agree to then accept that. So if an Ethiopian student wants to study in California, then basically the Californian universities look on the Cardano blockchain to verify that he indeed has the necessary qualifications. So it makes it much easier, especially these days when there's a lot of movement between countries, to make it easier to show, verify qualifications. So that's another good use case for blockchain. And another example is property rights, like land deeds, houses, or maybe even cars and so on. I mean, that's also sometimes a big problem in some countries. I mean, if you look, for example, at Syria, that has had a horrible civil war now for many years. And of course, a lot of these deeds offices have been destroyed in the war. So not only do people have to flee their country, I mean, when they come back, they might have nothing because they can't prove that their house is really theirs, or their property or farm or whatever really belongs to them, because there has been a lot of destruction and all the records have been lost. Of course, corruption is another danger for records. And so if you put things like that on the blockchain, that opens a lot of possibilities to make these things more secure, so that nobody has to be scared that he buys some piece of property or house and then can't prove that it's really his. If you use this write-only memory that you can't tamper with, that's censorship resistant, and that can't be modified after the fact. Okay, just a second to no, it's fine. Sorry. Okay, so of course Cardano is, I mean, it's a blockchain, but I mean, it's also a cryptocurrency. So let's talk about cryptocurrencies next. So according to Andy Greenberg, it's a digital asset designed to work as a medium of exchange using cryptography to secure the transactions and to control the creation of additional units of the currency. And for us, we can just think of a cryptocurrency as a blockchain specialized to financial transactions. So these ledger entries are financial transactions. As I said, Robertino sends 100 ADA to Karina. That would be an example of a transaction. And units of currencies are associated with public keys. So where in traditional finance, you are identified by, let's say, your signature or your ID or your passport. On cryptocurrencies, you identify yourself with a public key, which is some mathematical construct. It's just a long string of numbers. And it uses something called public-private key cryptography. So these keys come in pairs, the private part and the public part. And as the name suggests, the public part can be made public, and it serves like your address or your account number. And only you know the private key, and only you have access to the funds at your account, as long as you have the private key. So whoever has the private key is in control of the money associated with that key. And I mean, as I said, blockchain in principle is just this ledger, so it's just this abstraction that allows you to make entries into this big book, one after the other, that can't be tampered with, that can't be deleted, that can't be edited. And cryptocurrency is just a special case of this. But on top of these generic statements that are true for any blockchain, there are some special properties of cryptocurrencies that are not shared by any blockchain, that are specific to cryptocurrencies. One is the creation of new coins. So, I mean, that depends. So that's not the same for all cryptocurrencies. So, for example, with Bitcoin, each time a block on the Bitcoin network is minted, some new coins are created. But the amount of coins that's created, that gets cut in half every couple of years. But basically, Bitcoin, more and more coins are created. On Cardano, it's different. I mean, it feels similar, but it's actually different. So, I mean, on Cardano, it's actually very similar. I mean, Cardano, I think the total number of ADA is limited to 45 billion, but only something like, I don't know, 35 billion are in circulation at the moment. And every 5 days, a certain percentage of the remaining ones is put into circulation. So over time, but it will never be more than 45 billion. But there's also, specifically on Cardano, there is something called native tokens. So ADA is like the main cryptocurrency on Cardano, but there are also custom tokens, custom currencies. So everyone can create his own currency and basically decide what the monetary policy is. So under which conditions, if at all, new units of that coin can be created. And we will, in the Plutus part of the lecture, we will see examples of that, how you can make your own coin. Then there are transaction fees and rewards. So each time you do a transaction on Cardano, for example, but also on other cryptocurrencies, you have to pay a fee. And that fee is used to incentivize the people maintaining the blockchain to keep it running. So I mentioned these nodes, Cardano nodes, thousands of them all over the world. And they get part of the fees distributed every 5 days to motivate them, give them incentive to keep operating these blocks. And then a very interesting topic for us, especially for this course, is smart contracts. So, I mean, it's already very cool to be able to build a digital currency where people can send money from A to B, but it becomes much more interesting, smart contracts. So that's, I mean, we'll come to what that means later in the course, but in principle, it means that without smart contracts, in order to authorize a payment, you have to sign with your private key. So in order to unlock some money sitting at an account number, at an address, the owner of that account has to sign with his private key. And smart contracts allow you to generalize that condition, to replace the requirement for a signature with more or less arbitrary logic. And then you can do very interesting things like marketplaces where you don't have to trust each other in order to make the exchange happen, atomic swaps, auctions, lending protocols, even DAOs, like decentralized organizations, all of that can be done with smart contracts. Okay. And as I said, so in the second half of the course, we'll look at how to write smart contracts for the Cardano blockchain. Okay. Now, sorry. Right. Okay, so I mean, it's called blockchain because it's supposed to be a chain of blocks. So here in the slide, you can, I mean, each square represents one block. And there's a first block that, so index 0. And that is normally called the Genesis block. Let's see, right. And you can, I mean, if you will think of this analogy with the book, with the ledger, then a block would correspond to a page in the book. And of course, for a book, it's very important that the pages are in order. I mean, normally the pages are numbered. And if, for example, the book is a novel that you want to read, it's important that you have the right order of the pages, right? Because otherwise you know who the murderer is before you read about the crime. So the order is very important. And the same is true for ledgers and for blockchain. So the order of the blocks is important. So you can think of them as numbered starting at 0. And chain, because I mean, this ordering is achieved by each block, like block 4 here, contains a pointer to the previous block. So you can always follow this chain back to the Genesis block. So they are all in a well-defined linear order, pages in a book. And like pages in a book, I mean, each page contains several lines, and the same is true for blockchain. So each of these blocks contains several transactions, or potentially can contain several transactions. Okay, and as I said, the first one is traditionally called the Genesis block. So the Genesis block in particular basically specifies who has or owns the initial funds. So there's some sort of initial distribution of money to people, and then in following blocks, transfers can happen. Okay, so that's what, I mean, the mental picture basically. And of course, there are problems or questions. So how do you prevent forgery of ledger entries? How do you safeguard blocks against tampering? Just see. Sorry, I just want to. Right. So, I mean, the technology that makes blockchain possible is mostly cryptography, so the mathematical area of cryptography. But luckily for us, you don't have to be an expert in cryptography to work with blockchain or to be able to write smart contracts. Nevertheless, it's good to know some important concepts from cryptography, and one of the most important ones is hash function. So that's a function that takes an arbitrary bit string, byte string, so an arbitrary sequence of bytes, arbitrarily long, to a bit string of a fixed length. So, for example, I mean, SHA-256 is a common hash algorithm. I think that's called 256 because the length of a hash is 256 bits, so 32 bytes. So no matter how long the input byte string is, the resulting hash is always 32 bytes in this case. It doesn't, I mean, there are other algorithms that have different length, but it's always a fixed length. It's only called, I mean, it's a good hash function or a cryptographically secure hash function if it has additional properties. So it must be effectively computable, so relatively fast for given an input string to compute the hash. Collision-free means it should be virtually impossible that if you start with two different inputs, you get the same output. And I mean, if you know anything about mathematics, or at least, I mean, it's basically common sense. I mean, because the input string can be arbitrarily long. So there are infinitely many potential input strings. But because the output has a fixed length of bytes, for example, 32, there's only a finite number of potential output hashes. So you have an infinite input space and a finite output space. So obviously, that's the so-called pigeonhole principle in mathematics. Obviously, there must be inputs that map to the same output, because you can't fit infinitely many inputs into only finitely many outputs without there being collisions. So it can't really be collision free. There must be two inputs, many inputs, actually infinitely many inputs that map to the same output. But what this collision free means is that in practice, it's almost impossible to find such inputs that map to the same output. If you find something like that, then that's called a hash collision, and that's a big deal. And then normally, if somebody manages for a given hash algorithm to find such a collision, then that more or less means that the hash algorithm becomes useless, or at least not cryptographically secure anymore. So it's a bit of a paradox. Even though we know that there must be infinitely many collisions, in practice, it's almost impossible to find one. Hiding, I always forget what that means. I think it is that given the hash, it's impossible to basically conclude what the input was or to reconstruct the input. So to a given hash, it's impossible to find an input that hashes to that value. Again, theoretically impossible. I mean, practically impossible. Theoretically, of course, you can just try until you find one. And this puzzle-friendly is not really important for Cardano. That's more important for Bitcoin, where they have this proof of work. So that's not important. And so that's the one thing, hash. Hash is an important concept that appears all the time. And the second important thing that you basically need to or should know about cryptography is digital signatures. And the signature scheme consists of the following three things. So first of all, key generation. So you have some method to generate pairs of public key, public key, signing key. Then signing, given an arbitrary bit string and a signing key or secret key, you have a signing function that gives you a signature, the fixed length. Basically, that's then called the digital signature. You have some arbitrary input, you have your signing key, and you can sign with your signing key, and you get a digital signature. And finally, verification. So given the document and the signature and the public key of the signer, you must be able to verify that the signature was indeed created for this document with this secret key. So we must be able to verify that the document, I mean, the signature was produced by somebody that knows the secret key. And once you have that, you can basically, I mean, do digital signatures. And that's already all we need to know about this, I think. So I actually have a demo for that. I must just look for it. So maybe we complete the lecture, and then after the break, I can show you like a demo about this. Right. And same as for hashing, I mean, theoretically, it's always possible to break these things if you have like many age of universe length of time available. But in practice, it should be impossible to guess a valid signature without actually having the secret key. Right. And now, I mean, this is basically all you need to know about cryptography. And once you have these two things, we can answer the question or part of the question how to keep cryptocurrencies secure. So we talked about these ledger entries, and the requirement is that all these ledger entries are signed by somebody with the appropriate rights. So in the case of a cryptocurrency, in the case of transactions, so for example, Robertino sends money to Karina, then Robertino is the owner of the money being sent. So in this case, he should sign this transaction. So in practice, there wouldn't be just a ledger entry in the ledger saying Robertino sends 100 ADA to Karina. in addition to this entry, there would also be Robertino's signature under the entry. So that guarantees that this entry must have been made by Robertino, because only he knows his secret key, so only he is able to produce this signature. And furthermore, each block is signed by the creator of the block. And each block contains, I mean, I mentioned graphically, if you look at this again, sorry. I mean, these arrows, I mean, this is a picture, of course, in practice. How is this implemented? The block is hashed. So that's by hashing, or one of the reasons hashing algorithms are important. And then the hash, then the next block contains in its so-called header. So these blocks don't just consist of transactions, they also have a so-called header, like a small piece of data with the block number and the creator of the block and so on, and also the hash of the previous block. So here in block 4 at the header would be the hash of block 3. Block 3 would in its head contain a hash of block 2. And that makes it impossible to manipulate the blockchain itself. So because you have the hash. So if somebody tried to like modify, for example, the content of block 3, then that would change the hash of block 3, and then that would immediately be obvious because the hash has changed and block 4 contains the original hash. So using this combination, so where were we here? So the individual entries are secure because each of them is signed, each transaction is signed by the owner of the funds. And the consistency of this blockchain itself is guaranteed by using these hashes. So it's impossible to like drop a block or modify anything, even flip one bit in a block without changing the hash and then immediately making it obvious that something has changed. Right, so that's actually, I mean, two important problems that are solved this way, which is great. But that was basically the state of the art in the, I don't know, 1980s or 90s. But we had to wait for Bitcoin, for cryptocurrencies, for the first cryptocurrency until 2008. And that is one problem has only been solved by then, and that's the problem of forking. So if we look at this diagram of our ideal blockchain again, as I said, each block contains a pointer to the previous block. But if you only have that, so you have blocks and pointers to previous blocks, then nothing in this structure enforces that it's actually a chain. So you could have something like this. So in addition to block 3 and 4, you could have other blocks where block 3 prime also points to block 2. So actually, it's more like a tree. So it could, instead of a nice, neat linear chain, it could, or actually does, look more like a tree. And something like this is called a fork. So where, I mean, there are like two possible ways to continue. That's called a fork. And we don't want forks because, I mean, what does it, I mean, we want our nice, neat ledger abstraction with these entries, which tell us exactly in which order what has happened. And I mean, a fork like this, if this was possible, you can think of like in this block, maybe there's, I mean, let's say Robertino only has this 100 ADA I've been talking about. Let's say in this block is this transaction that Robertino sends 100 ADA to Karina. So maybe he gives her the 100 ADA and in exchange he gets, I don't know, a book. But now, let's say in this block, there's an entry also signed by Robertino that he sends 100 ADA to Antonio. So basically, he would spend the same money twice. So in this block, he gives it to Karina. In this block, he gives it to Antonio. And that is obviously something we don't want. I mean, that's exactly what money shouldn't be. I mean, that's the beauty of like actual money, fiat money, that you can't, I mean, it's like physical resources, like coins or bills. No,
Lars, we cannot hear you.
And that's used to be like the big roadblock with creating cryptocurrencies, that people didn't know how to prevent this, from happening. And then, of course, it's useless as money, because it only becomes valuable if you can't arbitrarily like spend it several times. Then it would be useless to use digital money if something like this was possible. So it's important that you don't have this picture, that you have this nice picture of basically this linear chain. And as I just explained, so it's important that everything is like in a neat linear order, and forks destroy this linear order. And that would mean, I mean, if that was possible, then it would mean you double spending, so you can spend the same money twice, which would make it useless. Right. And it's important to realize that we can't prevent forks from happening, like not completely. So you can, for example, think that, I mean, these blockchains, these nodes are distributed all over the world. And so you can, for example, think that at this point, some transatlantic cable was destroyed, maybe by a tsunami or whatever. So the internet split temporarily into two parts. I mean, like the US, for example, or all of Americas are separated from the rest of the world. So they can't communicate any longer. And even if nobody tries to cheat or anything, something like this could happen. So maybe this block 3 is done by some American Cardano node, and block 3 prime is done by a Kenyan Cardano node. And because the cable is interrupted, they don't know of each other. So nobody is being dishonest or trying to cheat, it just happens. So the point is that you can't prevent that. So it can always happen that due to network problems or other reasons that there are these forks. But that's where so-called consensus protocols come in. So consensus agreement, so that's protocols that try to achieve that these forks never become too deep. Let me just, right. So something like this is okay if this doesn't go much further. So actually, if you look at, for example, the Cardano blockchain, if all the blocks on the Cardano blockchain, it will not, sorry, let me just go back. It won't look like this. So it's not just this neat chain. So it will indeed look like that sometimes. But these forks will never become too deep. So there may be 1 or 2 blocks, maybe in extreme cases 3 or 4, but that's it. So it will never be hundreds of blocks. It will never branch out and look completely like a tree. So it will still be more or less a chain, and occasionally there will be these little branches, but they quickly die out. And that means, I mean, I don't know how much experience you have with cryptocurrencies, but for example, if you do a Bitcoin payment, normally you are supposed to wait for an hour or so until it's confirmed. And that's exactly the reason. So like close to the edge of time, I mean to the present time, there can be some confusion. So there can be like parallel things, that there can be forks. But if you go far enough back, not anymore. And that's the so-called common prefix property. So if you, for example, look at these two, if you think this is a node operator like in the United States, this is one in Kenya. So they have like a different view of the world, because for this one here, transactions here and here happened, whereas for that one, transactions here and here happened. But if they go far enough back in this example, 2 blocks, to block 2 and further, they agree on the history of the world. So it's only like the last 2 blocks in this example where there can be a where it can diverge. And that's so-called common prefix. And that's an important property that must hold for cryptocurrencies or for blockchain. So it may be that 2 people are not completely in agreement about what the content of the blockchain is, but if they go back further and further into the past, they start agreeing. And as I said, in Bitcoin, for example, if you go back 1 hour into the past, then normally the whole world agrees. In Cardano, I mean, it's not a black or white thing. It's not that if you go further than X minutes, then you're 100% secure. It's more probabilistic. So the further you go back in the past, the more sure you can be that everybody agrees. But it's an exponential drop off. So if you wait like 1 minute or whatever, 1 minute longer, then the chances of some disagreement half. And if you wait another minute, they half again, and so on. So it's very rapid. The longer you wait, the more secure you can be. And so in practice, if you wait 10 minutes or so on the Cardano blockchain, it's almost, I mean, like 99.9%, you can be sure that nothing will change anymore. Okay, that's explained in words here. So prefix, if you throw away the last K blocks, then each party should have the same view of the blockchain. And what K is depends on the blockchain. And I mean, it's fascinating or interesting. Can you build something like that? Can you create a protocol that actually achieves this, that has this property? And in principle, you couldn't if you can't make any other assumptions. But the assumption that is commonly made is so-called honest majority. So you assume that most people, or at least the majority of people, will follow this consensus protocol, whatever that is. And then you can mathematically prove that as long as a majority of people actually follows the protocol, then no matter what the minority does, even if people try to cheat and steal and destroy the blockchain, as long as the majority follows the protocol, everything is good. It's this so-called Byzantine fault tolerance. Byzantine in this, like Byzantine Empire, lots of wars and intrigues. So as long, I mean, even if there are people that actively try to sabotage things and cheat and steal, if it's not too many, if the majority is honest, then everything is good. And the blockchain still agrees and everybody is in consensus. Now, how to actually do this? That's where blockchains are different. So, for example, Bitcoin uses so-called proof of work. And there people like spend a lot of energy in the order of magnitude of a medium-sized country like Belgium to make this happen. And they basically, I mean, it's like it's not very important, but I mean, they try to solve so-called, I mean, hashing puzzles or crypto puzzles. So basically guessing tree images for hashes, and whoever guesses first has the right to create the new next block and gets rewarded for that. And so people are competing with faster and faster and more powerful computers to solve these hashing puzzles as fast as possible to get the block reward. And then you can prove, as long as the majority of hashing power in the world is honest in the sense that people follow this protocol, then Bitcoin is secure. ADA, Cardano uses a different consensus algorithm where you don't need these hashing puzzles. Instead, it's based on stake. So how many ADA do you own? The more ADA you own, the higher your chances to create a block on the blockchain. That has, for example, the advantage that Cardano is much less power energy hungry. So where in order to operate the Bitcoin network, as I said, energy of a medium-sized country, Cardano network is energy of like one house or one block of apartments or something. And you can run a Cardano node on a Raspberry Pi. But it has the same security guarantees. So you can also prove mathematically that as long as the majority of ADA holders is honest, follows the protocol is secure. So it's in that sense just as safe as Bitcoin, but it gets away with far less energy consumption. And the discovery of these consensus protocols, especially the Bitcoin protocol in 2008, it was the final piece of the puzzle, missing piece to make it possible to build blockchains. Right. And you just see how far I have. Right. sure whether we should maybe I can do this chapter still, and then we can have a break. Or are there any questions at this point?
Not so far, but
Okay.
everyone is encouraged to ask them, please.
I'm sorry, what?
Everyone is encouraged to ask the questions. So
Of course.
yes, even if you don't want to like talk, you can ask them in the chat, and I can stop Lars.
Yes, I have a question.
Please go ahead.
What happens in the scenario when you have a fork scenario and the party is an honest party? Would you integrate that new branch into the main branch or something like that?
So in this scenario here, it's I mean, the point of the consensus protocol is just that now the next person that makes a block, I mean, he can now decide, does he want to put it here or here? And it's indeterministic. We don't know. I mean, it could be both. But once he decides, for example, to put the new block here, then this piece is a bit longer than this piece. And there's the rule that honest block creators should always like try to make the longest chain longer. So at this point, they are both forks have the same length. So it's completely open. So this could win or that could win. But the next one now, so he basically flips a coin. He can use this one or this one. But if he takes this one here, then this branch is now longer, or this fork is now longer than the top one. And now the person doing the block after that will then, or should then, choose the longer one. So choose this one. So basically what the consensus protocol does is it encourages people to pick one and then stick to it. So it wouldn't be reintegrated. So one of the two here would fizzle out, basically. It would just not be made longer. But it's indeterministic which one. So we don't know in advance which of those will end up be the true blockchain. But one, I mean, what the consensus protocol achieves is it somehow makes sure that one of them, I mean, they won't both grow. One of them will keep growing, the other one will not. So it's always then obvious which is basically the true chain and which is just a fork. I mean, right now it's like fuzzy, so both could be, but this will be resolved, and somehow luck or fortune will decide which of the two gets prolonged, and then the other one will fizzle out. Does that answer the question?
Yes, I think so.
Great.
Thank you much.
You're welcome. Other questions? Okay, let's briefly look at transactions in a bit more detail. So this is now maybe that's not true for all cryptocurrencies, in particular not for Ethereum, but it is true for Bitcoin and for Cardano. So transaction consists of inputs. So that's the money that is spent by this transaction. And that can be one or more. So as an example, I always said Robertino sends 100 ADA to Karina, but it could also be more than one source of money. Well, anyway, then a list of outputs. So it can also be more than one. And output is specified by how big it is, how many coins, and who gets it. And each input has to be signed by the owner in principle. So for example, yeah, let's see, I think there's...
Lars?
Yes?
We have another question. How is forking possible if hashing produces a unique identification of the next block?
Because it doesn't. It has a unique identification not of the next block, of the previous block. So block 3 and block 3 prime both point to this block 2. They both point to block 2, but I mean, block 2 doesn't know what the next block will be. I mean, can't know because that's in the future. You don't know yet what transactions will happen in the future. So the arrows always point towards the past. So the past is always uniquely determined by the hashes, but not the future. It's directed towards the past. So therefore, in principle, these tree structures happen. there's a well-defined root of the tree, the Janus block, but I mean, in the other direction, it's not unique because I mean, at this point here, block 2, you don't know what the next transaction will be. So block 2 has no way of knowing what block 3 will look like because that's in the future still.
Yes.
Okay. So this is, let's look at the diagram of 2 Cardano transactions that maybe, or you could also think, yeah, okay, Cardano transactions. So these rectangles are transactions. So time goes from left to right, and these dots are basically coins or outputs, so-called UTXOs, unspent transaction outputs. So the first transaction, Alice wants to send 10 ADA to Bob, and she has like 1 coin worth 100 ADA. So she can construct a transaction where the input is this 1 coin that she owns. And you always, on Cardano, always have to spend the inputs completely. So she wants to send 10 ADA to Bob, but she has to spend the full 100 ADA. So in order to, I mean, because she only wants 10 to send 10 ADA, so what does she do with the difference? She creates a second input back to herself with the change. That's a so-called change output. So this would be a simple example of a Cardano transaction. So 1 input, 100 ADA from Alice, 2 outputs, 10 ADA to Bob and 90 ADA back to Alice. And this input would need to be signed by Alice, or rather, I mean, the transaction needs to be signed by Alice because it uses an input that belongs to Alice. So only Alice can create this transaction because she needs to sign it. Now we see a second transaction where Alice and Bob want to send 110 ADA to Charlie. So now we have a transaction that has 3 inputs. One is this change output from the first transaction belong to Alice. One is the output that from the first transaction that belongs to Bob. And the third is some other coin that wasn't affected by the first transaction, also belonging to Bob. So 3 inputs and 3 outputs. The 110 ADA to Charlie, change. So every, I mean, Alice and Bob each want to pay 55. So Bob now basically his input from Bob was 10 and 50, so it's 60. And in order 55 for Charlie's 5 go back to Bob. And Alice put 90 in, 55 for Charlie, so 35 change. So this is an example of a more complicated transaction with 3 inputs and 3 outputs. And because the inputs belong to Alice, Bob, Bob, the transaction needs to be signed by both Alice and Bob because funds of both Alice and Bob are spent in this transaction. Also, what you see here, it's a very nice and important property of the Cardano blockchain. Nothing ever changes. I mean, nothing gets mutated or modified. The only thing that happens is that some outputs are spent and new ones are created, but the existing outputs are never modified. So we can't like strike out 100 here and replace it by 90, which is what would happen on Ethereum. Instead, basically, we just spend existing outputs and create new ones. That's the only effect that transactions have. They never modify anything. They only modify the set of unspent transaction outputs. That's a very nice and very important property. And if you, I mean, when you learn more about Haskell, you will also see that it is a perfect fit for Haskell. Because Haskell also mostly uses so-called immutable data structures, it never or very seldom mutates data in place, but rather creates new data. So it's a very natural fit actually. Right, but this is, as I said, it could also be on Bitcoin. If you replace ADA with Bitcoin, the same picture would also be valid on Bitcoin, but not on Ethereum. Ethereum works differently. And then, I mean, the transaction can be valid or invalid. And for it to be valid, I mean, it must be signed by the right people that the inputs belong to. The signatures must, of course, be valid. and the sum of input must be at least as big as the sum of outputs. And I mean, this is a bit fuzzy. Yes.
Sorry. So we have another question. What if Alice had 100 ADA and she wants to send the whole amount to Bob? Will Bob send a transaction change of 0, or he will not send a transaction change? So is it
If Alice wants
mandatory to
if
create the
no,
change?
it's not mandatory. It's not. You don't need an output of 0. And on Cardano, you can't have an output of 0. Each output has something called a minimal deposit. So there must always be something like 1.1 ADA in every output. And it depends a bit. It can also be more. And because of transaction fees, if Alice really only had 100 ADA, she couldn't send 100 ADA to Bob, because she also has to pay some transaction fees. So her input must be slightly larger. But if, for example, she had 101 ADA, then she could send 100 Bob and not have any change output. So you don't always need a change output.
That's it. Thanks.
And there can also be more than one change outputs if you want. So yeah, it must just end up. Right. So basically, I mean, this is precise in the Cardano ledger, but in principle, it means, I mean, you must put at least as much in as you take out at the other end, and there must be enough overhead difference to pay for transaction fees. And then this is not completely true when native tokens enter the picture. Sometimes a transaction can create money out of thin air, these new tokens, these custom tokens, but we'll come to that later. And then a block is just a list of transactions, and that is valid if the person creating it has the right to create the block at that time. So that depends on the consensus protocol. So in the case of Bitcoin, that's if the block creator solves these hashing puzzles. In the case of ADA, Cardano, there's something like a lottery, and you must win this lottery to create the next block. Then you must sign, your signature must be valid, all the transactions in the block must be valid, and all the transactions must be consistent. So that means no double spending. So that each transaction must only, I mean, this transaction is only valid at the point where this is in the blockchain. This and this and this output are still available. I mean, for example, if this transaction tried to spend that output, it would be invalid because that output has already been spent by this transaction. Okay. Right. And yes, I mean, this is again specific to cryptocurrencies. This would be true for all blockchains. Right. And as I said, so in practice, the sum of input values will be a bit higher than the sum of output values. And this is then called transaction fees, the difference. And how high those are and whether you need them or not depends on the cryptocurrency and who gets them. So in Bitcoin, the block creator gets them. So the block creator can keep all the fees. And on top of that, he also gets like a special reward for every block. In Cardano, it works differently. So it's not directly the block creator who gets the fees. Instead, the fees are collected for 5 days, the so-called epoch on Cardano, and then are distributed amongst all block creators according to a certain quite complicated formula. Right. And so maybe, I don't know, I think half the time is up. So maybe we should have a break now before I go into this. Let's say 10 minutes break until Q2, and then we continue, except if there are questions right now.
Okay. No questions so far.
Okay, let me stop sharing for a second. Okay, then 10 minutes or 9 minutes.
Okay. If anyone has
Okay.
questions, feel free to write it during the break and we can answer them after. Okay.
Okay. Continue. Are there any questions in the meantime?
Not so far.
Okay. Then let me share again. So I did find this demo I promised you. So maybe just 5 minutes or 2 minutes. So this is for hashing. So here I can, I mean, just some stupid little demo. So here I can type some arbitrary text. And down here, you see the hex encoded input. So for example, Haskell, yeah. So this is just it's encoded as hexadecimal, and then you see the hash. And I mean, some things you can see here. So for example, no matter what I type here, the input gets longer and longer, but the hash is always this fixed length. In the case of SHA-256, 32 bytes. And what you can also see is that if I make a very small change, the hash completely changes. So for example, if I add just an exclamation point, you see the hash is completely different. So small changes in the input can mean big changes in the output. So for example, I mean, if have something like Robertino sends 100 ADA to Karina, then this is the hash. But if now Karina wanted to cheat and manipulate that, the hash dramatically changes. So that's one thing that's hashing. And I also have a little demo for signing. So I have a message. So for example, again, Robertino sends 100 ADA to Karina. On the left, this is basically the signer, and this is the verifier. So the signer can generate a key pair, so private key, public key, and this is the signature of this document. So one thing we see is the signature. I mean, if you have, like, if you think naively, if you sign, I mean, your signature on a piece of paper is just like, I mean, some squiggle. But, and that squiggle is more or less always the same, no matter what you sign. You, of course, naive, you could think digital signatures are the same. So maybe this is always Robertino's signature. But that's, of course, silly, because then you could just copy paste that and easily forge a signature. So one important point of digital signatures is they depend on the input text. So if I, instead of, I mean, now it's E864 something, if instead I turn the point here into an exclamation point, sorry, then we get a completely different signature. So the signature is dependent on the input text. That's one thing. Okay, and now, so the verifier doesn't have access to the private key, only to the public key. So this button just copied the public key from here to here. And then it can verify the message. So I can now try to verify, copy the signature. So this is what the verifier sees the message, the signature, and the public key of the signer, and can verify. So it's verified. But if now, for example, Karina tried to cheat and say this was the original message, then it doesn't verify. So that's how you can make sure that this is how basically transactions themselves or entries in the lecture are cryptographically secured against manipulation. Right, just what I wanted to show this demo. So now can continue here, except if there are any questions.
Not so far.
No. I mean, we don't have to go very deep into this. It's just a little bit. So, I mean, IOG, the company we work for, is input output global. We used to be called input IOHK, input output Hong Kong. It's like an engineering company. I think this is no longer accurate. I mean, we used to be like engineering company for cryptocurrencies, but I mean, we try to diversify now. So it's no longer just cryptocurrencies. But our like flagship product, at least for the last years, has been the Cardano blockchain. So we basically built the Cardano blockchain for the technology for it. We've also worked. I mean, we have also worked like on, for example, Ethereum Classic. We do a lot of academic research. So we employ a lot of researchers. So I would say our approach is always science first. So we do like proper science with peer-reviewed papers, and then once the science is verified, we convert it into engineering and try to be as rigorous as possible, employing formal methods, mathematical proofs, formal verification, and so on. And we also try to like, I mean, Cardano is the main thing, but there are also variations like different flavors of the consensus protocol, for example. So it's not just Cardano, it's also like general tools to develop cryptocurrencies. And as I said, science and getting it right, verifying everything is very important. So therefore, instead of cutting corners, we try to get things right. Okay, so yeah, that's slide for IOG. And now, let me see. Right. So why Haskell? I think the actual answer is that our founder, Charles Hoskinson, just liked Haskell, but maybe as good a reason as any. But I think it's a very good choice to build a cryptocurrency. I mean, of course, right now you probably don't know much about Haskell or don't know anything about Haskell, but it has an extremely high level of abstraction. So, which is good if you want to build complex and complex system where security is very important, like a blockchain cryptocurrency. It's very expressive, also very terse, so don't have to type very much. It's perfect, as we will see later in the course with many examples, for writing so-called DSLs, domain-specific languages, and like the protocol, the consensus protocol, or also the network protocols that the nodes, the Cardano nodes use to communicate with each other are basically DSLs. So Haskell is like really made for that sort of thing. It's very close to mathematics, which means it's easier to formally prove something in Haskell than it is for other programming languages. And it's statically typed with a very sophisticated type system. So a lot of people don't like statically typed languages because they feel that the types get in their way. So in Haskell, it tends to be the other way around. The type system is so expressive that it very rarely gets in your way. On the contrary, it often helps you to, I mean, guides you. So the compiler is basically your friend and helps you find the correct implementation. Of course, this is all now doesn't necessarily make sense, but hopefully by the end of the course, you will all agree to that with that. Okay, and yes, and it's fun, at least in our opinion. Haskell is a lot of fun. So I hope you will also learn to love it. Okay, so that was this. Yeah.
Well,
There's
yes.
a question. Yeah. The question is, in the example you showed us, could you demonstrate what Karina can do if she gets hold of the sender's private key?
Oh yeah, sure. Yes, I can. I mean, if Karina gets hold, if Karina gets hold of the sender's private key, so she has now the private key, then she can manipulate. Yes.
Yeah, I think I could answer such a question.
Okay.
So anyone who holds a private key is the one who has the rights to the totality of a particular cryptocurrency assets. So it can manipulate, it can send, it can transfer, can do all sort of things. So that is why private key has to be confidential. It has to be known by the bona fide owner of the assets itself. So it's not advisable that one give out his private key because it's a very confidential something, so to say.
Yes, exactly. So if Karina had Robertino's private key, this one, then she could manipulate this and say he didn't just send me 100, he sent me 1,000 ADA. And because now she has the private key, she can sign with this. So she can create this signature. And then it's valid again. So then she can sign arbitrary messages in Robertino's name and do like bad things. Steal all his money, for example.
Is
Okay.
another question. Is Cardano like Ethereum where people can build dApps?
Yes, I mean, dApps is more or less a synonym for smart contract. So the second, of course, Cardano is much better than Ethereum because you can build much nicer apps or dApps. But yes, I mean, smart contracts means you can build dApps, and we will see examples of that in the second half of the course. And we know enough Haskell. Because our smart contract language is heavily influenced by Haskell. I mean, there are these days, as Cardano matures, there are alternatives. You don't necessarily need to know Haskell anymore to write dApps for Cardano, but it's nevertheless still the best supported and most powerful way, I would say, to write dApps on Cardano. Any other questions?
No. Good.
Okay, then let's now look at some Haskell. Sorry, just 1 second. Must open the other presentation. Sorry, yeah, okay. Okay, I think I switched to live editor soon. Maybe I can start with the slide at least here. Right, so this is the first, I mean, types are very important in Haskell. So often you start programming by defining types.
Sorry, Lars, I cannot see your screen.
Or maybe, yeah, there was, so let me try a second. For some reason I did, maybe I was too fast. Let me stop and start again. Can you see it now?
Yeah.
Okay. So often you start programming Haskell by defining the types you want to work with. So it's very easy and lightweight in Haskell to define your own types. So it's much easier and faster to define a type in Haskell than to, for example, define a class in C#. It's far less boilerplate. So here in this snippet, we basically define 2 types. One called chain and one called TXS. So some terminology. So we have various data types. In this case, chain and int. So int is the type of machine integers, which nowadays is normally 64 bits. Even though in all, like it's not prescribed by the, I mean, it could in some Haskell implementations, it could be 32 bits or so. But I think in practice, it's normally 64. There's also, as we will see, many more numeric types in Haskell. But int is like a common one for integers, like 64-bit integers, signed integers. Then we have so-called constructors, so ways to define, to construct data. And those constructors can take arguments, which are also called fields. So in this case, this chain data type has 2 constructors. One is called Genesis block, one is called block. Genesis block doesn't have any arguments, and block has 2 arguments. one of type chain, which is the data type we're just defining right now. So it's a recursive data type. And the other of type TXS. So here we see two keywords. One is the data keyword, which defines a new data type. So we're defining a new data type chain here, which with two constructors, Genesis block and block. Type doesn't define a new data type, it gives a new name to an existing data type. So in this case, type gives a new name to the int data type. Okay, and now that we have this type definition, we can actually define chains. So we could, for example, define a chain that we call chain 1 equal sign. So, I mean, other languages would be maybe a colon equal or so. In Haskell, it's just an equal, like in mathematics. And then we would use one of the constructors, in this case, the block constructor. And if we look back, so the block constructor expects two arguments, chain and TXS, which is int. So, sorry. So this is the first argument of type chain. And if we go back, so another constructor of chain is Genesis block. So Genesis block is a chain, so that can serve as the first argument. And then we need second argument of type TXS, which is just int. So for example, we can take 2. And we can define a second chain where the block constructor, whereas first argument of type chain, we take the chain we just defined in the first step. And as the int argument, we take 4. Just for motivation, I mean, of course, the names are completely arbitrary, but it is supposed to look like a mini toy blockchain where we have a Genesis block and then blocks on top of it that have like a link to the previous block chain, and then some sort of payload. And in this, I mean, in a real blockchain, these would be transactions, but now, as an example, it's just integers. And we also see, I mean, in other programming languages that you are more familiar with, probably there would be parentheses here and maybe a comma. So it would be block. I mean, in JavaScript or so, if you apply a constructor, or in whatever, C#, TypeScript, it would have like parentheses, and then the arguments would be separated by comma. In Haskell, it's just like that. So the space, or there's no syntax for function application. So this just means apply this constructor to these arguments. That's what I meant earlier with terse. So the notation is very terse, very little clutter, I mean, much fewer parentheses and curly braces and stuff and semicolons as in other languages. Let me try to switch to, so I always think it's more fun to do this live and just see whether everything. So I think I'm now running this locally. So I'm not using one of this Gitbot or the dev container, but you probably should. Right, so this is Visual Studio. And we will talk about how to set up Haskell projects in a later lecture. So how to like organize everything. So right now I just started with an empty file. These Haskell so-called modules files. So each file is a module. It always starts with module, name of the module, where. But we'll get into that later. But the way it's set up now, I can build it with Cabal build. And so here I split my screen. So this is the editor, this is this file. And down here I have a terminal right now. One of the cool things about Haskell is it's very interactive. So you can basically interact with the program while you're writing it. I mean, it's a bit similar to Python, also has that, or like a JavaScript console or something like that. And you can invoke the REPL with Cabal REPL, which I'm doing now. So now I'm in the REPL. And now I can type Haskell expressions and evaluate them. So for example, I could do 3 plus 4, and I get 7. And I can, with colon R, I can reload the module. So if I modify something here, I can reload it. So let's just copy the slide. So try, so what was it? Data chain was Genesis block chain TXS. So it's complaining because TXS has not yet been defined. So let's do this. So TXS was just a synonym for int. Okay. I save and I reload. So everything compiles. That's another thing you should get used to. So don't write hundreds of lines of code before you compile for the first time. You should compile like permanently, basically every minute or every 10 seconds. Because it's very depressing and frustrating. If you don't, then you probably will have dozens or hundreds of errors, especially as a beginner. And then it's very disheartening to try and find to fix it. So I always try to keep my module compiling at all times, if possible. Right, and now we can, we defined these things, chain and TXS. So now in the REPL, we can ask for information about it. That's colon I, I think also colon info, which is abbreviation. So we saw the colon R for reload. So now there's colon I. So for example, I can ask for chain and I get information. Basically, I see the definition here and where it's defined. I can, of course, also ask for TXS. So, and I see it's a synonym for int. Right now it's not very impressive because I see exactly the same here. If you're in a larger project where you don't necessarily know where all the types have been defined and what they are, it can be very useful. So now for our example chains. So chain 1, what was it? It was block, Genesis block. Was it 2 for 2? 2. And chain 2, block, chain 1, 4, I think. I can reload. I get warnings. I'm not sure whether in the slides. Just want to check. No. Right. Before I go on here with the, let me just define this one as well. Right. So instead of using chain 1 here, I basically inline the definition. Right. Like this. Okay. We already see these suggestions here. So I get, this is not errors. If I reload, let's see the compiler says it's okay. So these are warnings. And the warning is that I should give a so-called type signature. In this case is already suggested by some extension to Visual Studio Code. So it's always good practice to give so-called type signatures to everything, to all the top level expressions in your module. So this type signature says, so this line here reads chain 1 is of type chain. This says chain 2 is of type chain, and this says chain 2 prime is of type chain. So that's one thing. So now the warnings should go away. And now in principle, I showed you the 3 plus 4 earlier here somewhere. So I should also be able to do chain 1. But when I do this, then it complains and says, basically it doesn't know how to display chains. And we can fix that. This is something we can, we will go into much detail later. But by adding this, it basically just tells the compiler to derive a way to display chains. So now if I do chain 1, I get an output here. If I do chain 2, I go chain 2 prime, I get the same. So this is how I can interact with my code, like at live, while I'm developing it. Let me switch back to the slides. So these are bindings, so-called bindings, because I bind a name, chain 1, chain 2, chain 2 prime, to an expression. And after I've done this binding, I can use the newly bound name in other expressions. So here I bind chain 1, and then I can use it here. And actually in Haskell, the order doesn't matter. So if I take this chain 1 here and move it to the end, then everything is still fine. So even though at this point here chain 1 is not defined, it's only defined further down, that's fine. So it doesn't matter in Haskell in which order you bind these things. As long as if it's in the same module, it's fine. So let's see. So that's binding. Binding has a left-hand side. Binding has a right-hand side. And these things on the right-hand side are so-called expression. So that's things in Haskell that have values. Value would be a synonym. Okay. And expressions can be built from, complicated expressions can be built from smaller expressions. So in this one here, this also an expression, like a sub-expression. So is like block, Genesis block 2, all these things are expressions, things that have values. Right, so we have defined data types, and we have I have applied the constructors to construct some values of that type. So now we have 2 chains to play with. Now let's define our function. So function of paramount importance in Haskell. Everything is basically, writing Haskell means writing functions. Everything is a function. So let's write our first function. And the idea is to determine the length of a chain. And what does this syntax mean? So we give 2 equations to define, we define this chain length function. The idea is it gets as input chain, and the output, the result will be an int, and it will denote the length of the chain. So this first line says the Genesis block chain, Genesis block is a chain, and by definition it has length 0. And if you have a chain that uses the block constructor, then in order to compute the length, we don't care what the payload is, the second argument. The underscore means we don't care about this value. We only care about the first argument, which we call C. And then we recursively determine the length of C and add 1. So again.
Sorry, Lars.
Yes.
There is a request that if you can repeat the previous code.
But they weren't sure what the code was doing, so maybe they were just defining.
Right, it's just it's defining values of type chain. I could also do something like my favorite number. Copilot is just.
Copilot knows you.
Yeah, Copilot knows me too well. So I can just basically give names to things. So it's just a way to define, for example, values. So I can define ints, but it doesn't have to be an int. It can also be a chain. It can be anything of any type. So I'm just defining things, values. And now we see this, what was it called? Chain length. So chain length. Genesis block is 0, and chain length block previous don't care is chain length C plus 1. And before we fix this, so it works. I mean, I get a warning again because I haven't given a signature, but I can already try it out. So this is now the first function so we defined. So I can, for example, say chain length Genesis block, and I do get, okay, I should probably, so let me give a signature, chain length. Okay, so now earlier, I mean, it was like a type like int or chain. Now it's a function, and the syntax to denote the type of function in Haskell is with an arrow. So this is a function that takes a chain and gives me an int. So the type of chain length is function type. That's this arrow here. And on the left-hand side of the arrow is the input type, which is chain. And on the right-hand side is the output type, which is int. So this says chain length is a function from chains to, from chain to int. I can, as an argument, give a chain to chain length, and I get an int as a result. So if I do this and try chain length Genesis block, I get 0. So that's this first equation. If I now take our, instead of Genesis block, I take our chain 1, I get length 1. Why is that? Well, chain 1 uses the block constructor. So the second equation applies. And the C here, in the case of chain 1, is Genesis block. So we see, in order to compute the length of chain 1, we must do chain length of C, which is chain length of Genesis block, which is 0 plus 1. So we get 1. If we do the chain length of chain 2, we get 2. I think we'll see this in more detail here. So I already explained the type signature. Then we have these different cases. We see we have one equation per constructor. And we have, again, left-hand side, right-hand side. And this is something new. This is a so-called pattern. So when Haskell tries to evaluate an expression like chain length chain 2, it looks up the definition of chain length and sees there are several equations. So it tries them from top to bottom until one of these patterns matches. It's called pattern match. I think these days you also get pattern matches even in TypeScript and other languages. So this pattern here will match if the chain is the constructor Genesis block, and the second equation will match if the chain I want to compute the length of uses the block constructor. And then if it uses the block constructor, the block constructor had 2 arguments, then the C gets bound to the first argument, and whatever I write here would get bound to the second. The underscore means I don't care about that value in order to compute the length. But I could also, write L or something there for length. But then my editor would warn me that I define this L, but I'm not using it. And that warning goes away if I use an underscore instead. So, okay, and the right-hand side are expressions. And we see this is a recursive function. So in order to calculate the length of a chain that uses the block constructor, I recursively call the chain length function on the predecessor chain, this one. Okay, I showed these things. This example, the last one I haven't done. So equals is the equality, comparison operator in Haskell for equality. So as we know, chain length chain 1 was 1 and chain length chain 2 was 2, and 1 does not equal 2. That's why I get false. If I have 2 equal things, I get true. Okay, and now what I already verbally explained, how, for example, chain length 2 works. So first, the definition of chain 2 is substituted. So chain 2 was block chain 1, 4.
Lars, we have another question.
Yes?
Is chain length an inbuilt function in Haskell?
No, no, no. I just defined it.
Maybe they were confused because of the recursion, but yeah.
I don't know. But everything here is just defined. So chain I defined, TXS I defined, my favorite number defined. I defined these chains and I defined this function here.
The chain length Lars uses inside the chain length definition is
Ah,
the function itself that is
yeah,
being
it's
defined.
recursive. It calls itself. Yeah, I understand now. Yes, now I understand what you mean. No, it's not built in. It's this one. That's defining. I'm defining it in terms of itself. It's a recursive function. Recursion is used a lot in Haskell in favor over loops in other programming languages. So we can see how it works just now. So how does, I mean, this chain length 2, I mean, it gives 2, but how does Haskell come to this result? So, and all Haskell does in principle is substitute definitions. So chain length 2, sorry, chain length chain 2. So what does Haskell do? So first it looks up what chain 2 is. And chain 2 was defined as block chain 1, 4. So Haskell just substitutes the definition here. Right. Now, how does it make progress now? Now it looks at the definition of chain length and goes through the equations top to bottom. So the first equation assumes that the argument uses the Genesis block constructor, but this is not it. So this first equation doesn't fit. So it looks at the second equation and tries to match this pattern. Is the argument of type block something, something? And indeed it is. This is the shape of the argument. So the second equation applies. And now the first argument gets the name C. The second argument is ignored. So now on this chain 1 gets the name C. The 4 is ignored. So now we substitute the right-hand side. So this is now chain length of C. C was chain 1 plus 1. So we can write chain length of chain 1 plus 1. So now chain length is not a built-in function. We are just defining it. So now this is the same function again. It called itself, but with a different argument. I mean, first it was called with chain 2. Now it's called with chain 1. So we have made some progress. It won't loop forever. Okay, so now it's the same thing again. How do I compute this? Well, it looks up the definition of chain 1, which is block Genesis block 2, and substitutes it here. Now it needs to compute this. So again, it goes through the equations. Again, the first equation doesn't match, but the second does. So it's again uses the block constructor, and C is now Genesis block. So it's now chain length of Genesis block plus 1 plus 1. So this equation, C is now Genesis block, so we get chain length Genesis block plus 1. So this is substituted here, and this plus 1 we still have from before. So now again, what's this? It was another recursive call. But now the first equation applies, which is not recursive. So we know chain length of Genesis block is 0. So this here can be replaced with 0. So we get 0 plus 1 plus 1. And then that's simplified to 1 plus 1, which is 2. So that's in detail how basically Haskell evaluates this function, how it figures out that the chain length of chain 2 is 2. Are there any questions to this?
Not so far.
Good. Okay, and this is also called equational reasoning because these equations are really like equations in the mathematical sense. And Haskell has this very important property called, what's it called? Referential transparency. So you can always substitute like equal part things anywhere. So wherever I write chain 1, I can just as well write block genesis block 2, because those two are equal. And basically, so you can more or less mathematically prove that the result, I mean, that the chain length of chain 2 is 2. So that's actually quite powerful, and that is also something that's not true in other languages. I'm not sure, just a second. But I think I must put up some speed. Okay. But yeah, I mean, we also started half an hour earlier, so. I mean, this will all also come in much more detail in future lectures. So this is just to give you a first impression, basically. A lot of stuff. Okay. Right. So that's our very first function. Right. Now we want to write a function that checks whether one of the payloads is a given number. So for example, in this chain 2, we have the 2 and the 4 appearing as payloads or as second argument of this block constructor. So we want to write a function that, given an x, an integer x, and a chain, decides whether that x appears somewhere in the chain. So what do they call it here? Has block. So x is the integer, and we have the chain. So if it's the genesis block, no matter what x is, it doesn't appear here, because the genesis block in our definition doesn't carry any payloads, doesn't have any integers attached to it. So the answer is false. And if it's block Cn, well, so either this n here could equal x, in which case the answer would be yes. And we can check that with n equals x. And if not, we can also, or we can try to find our x in the previous part of the chain. So recursively call our function has block x on C. Right. So this vertical bars here is logical disjunction in Haskell, so or, logical or. So this means n equals x, or x appears recursively in C. Okay, again, we should give a type signature. This is now a function with two arguments, x and genesis block, and this is written in Haskell like this. So this means it's, in principle, it's a function with two arguments, one of type txs, which was just a synonym for int, one of type chain, and it gives us a bool. I can also ask for information on bool because we haven't seen that yet. And we see bool is a type with two constructors, false and true, neither of which has any arguments. So it's two constructors that have 0 arguments. So bool only has two values, false and true, so booleans. Right, and we also see that the x is not needed here in the first equation. So I can, I can replace it with an underscore to make the editor happy. Right. So that's the second function. And now we, for example, we can ask has block 2 chain 2, which is, I must reload, which is true. But for example, 7 is not there, that's false. So it seems to work. Okay, tested it. Oh yeah, that's something we haven't seen yet. So I mean, we have seen the :R for reload and the :I for info, for example, chain. There's another important one, :T for type. So I can ask it for the type of things. For example, I can ask what's the type of false, and it tells me false is of type bool. I can also ask for the type of hasBlock, and it tells me hasBlock is of type XS to chain to bool. And the cool thing is, if I remove this line again and reload, then it gives me the same thing. This is an example of Haskell's so-called type inference. So S is strongly typed, everything has a type, and the compiler is very, very strict about it, that you only have type correct expressions everywhere. But nevertheless, you don't have to annotate everything with types, because in most cases, especially in standard Haskell, the compiler can figure out the types for you. So these, I said we should always use these type signatures, but that's more for human readers and for documentation purposes. The compiler can figure all of that out by himself. That's also how my editor knows what I should put there. Right, and I mean, this looks a bit strange, I suppose, with these two errors as for a function with two arguments. Actually, this error in Haskell associates to the right. So this is the same as if we put parentheses here. And we see that this now is actually not a function of two arguments. It's a function of one argument, namely of TXS, which returns a function from chain to bool. So that's another way to look at it. So instead of considering this as a function with two arguments, TXS and chain, we can also look at it as a function with one argument of type TXS, where the return type, the result type, is another function. So in particular, and we can also partially apply. So that's this here. So if we have this, if we ask for the type of hasBlock, then we get this. We can also ask for the type of hasBlock, for example, 7. So apply one argument, and we say hasBlock 7 is again a function. It's now a function from chain to bool. So we have partially applied this argument, and we get a function from chain to bool. If we now also give it a chain, then it has type bool. And then we can evaluate it and get false in this case. Right, that's called currying. That in Haskell, I mean, if you're pedantic, there are no multi-argument functions in Haskell. Haskell only has functions with one argument. But basically, because of the syntax and this currying thing, you can use functions of argument that return functions as functions of several arguments. And it's very flexible because you can do these partial applications. I mean, you can also do this in other programming languages, but there normally you have to jump through a lot of hoops. And so recently, I mean, there's a TypeScript library for functional programming that does curry functions. But I mean, they have to really do work to make that happen. In Haskell, it's built in, this partial application currying. It's called currying after Haskell Curry, who was a logician and after whom Haskell is named. Right. And there are a lot of those in Haskell. So we saw disjunction, which takes two booleans, returns a boolean, logical OR. There's also logical AND. We saw the block constructor, which takes two arguments, a chain and TXS, to produce a chain. Constructors are also functions. I mean, special functions because they construct values of data types, but nevertheless functions. So we could ask for the type of, for example, Genesis block. It's of type chain, but we can also ask for the type of block, our other constructor, and that's of type chain to TXS to chain. So block takes a chain and TXS and gives us a chain back. which we have done here and here. And operators like this, these vertical for logical OR and the ampersands for AND are just auto functions that you can use infix. And actually, you can switch between the two. So if you have like operators, by default, they are used infix. And like functions with a name like our chain length are used prefix. So, but you can change it. So if you want to use an operator prefix, you can put it in parentheses. And if you want to use a function infix, you can put it backticks. So, I mean, we have this OR. So, for example, true or false is true. And if I want to use the operator prefix, I put it in parentheses. And then I can use it like a normal function. And I get the same result. And same, I mean, we had this block, for example, blockchain 1.7, whatever. But if I want to use the block like an infix operator, I can. I must just then put it in backticks, and I get the same result. So that's that. There are also priorities. So if I ask, I can ask for a lot information on a lot of things in Haskell in the REPL. For example, for information on this, so I get the signature. But I also get this line here, which tells me this is right associative with precedence. And you can also define precedences for your own functions with this syntax. So, for example, if we look at plus and multiplication, ignore this num stuff here for the time being. Doesn't matter. But we see that multiplication has a higher precedence than addition. And that means that you don't need so many parentheses. So if I do 3 plus 4 times 5, it gives me 23. So it knows the multiplication has higher precedence, so it does that first before it does the addition. And that's, you can define these precedences yourself. Right, and we can also define our own operators. So I could, this block, I can instead define a function with the same signature as block. So we saw block goes from chain to TXS to chain. So I can define an operator. So it's just the same syntax as for functions, except that I am the operator into parentheses. So chain TXS chain. And as definition, I just say it's block. And I can do what was it here, infix left 5. Okay. And now I have defined my own operator with custom precedence. So now for this chain 2, for example, I can write Genesis block 2. And this is the same as what I defined earlier with the block constructor. It gives me the same result, but it looks nicer. Oh. Was there a question?
Yes, I have a question. What about
Yes.
the precedence? The precedence is like order that you have to follow, but what is the order that you have to follow? You have the lower numbers first, or
The highest.
the highest? Oh, okay.
Yes. So in this case, it's a good question. I also always forget. But here is an example. We see addition has 6 and multiplication has 7. And if I do this, it does multiplication first. So it does the higher first. It first does 4 times 5 and then plus 3.
Okay, okay.
Right. And the highest precedence is function application. So something like block genesis block application of a function to something that has the highest precedence. So that's why, for example, here it's chain length C and then +1 and not chain length of C +1, because the chain length binds strongest. So this here is evaluated first and afterwards 1 is added. But of course, I mean, you should never rely on it. I think that's true for every programming language. Rather add some more parentheses to make it clearer. I mean, rather add some more parentheses than make mistakes because you assume it will work some way, but it doesn't. I mean, it works a different way.
Yes, I think so.
And right here, I mean, this L is for left associative. So this means in this case, we do the first one first. So the parentheses, I mean, they bracketed from the left. So first this and then that. If I put an R there instead, it would first try to do the 2, 4, and then this. So that's the L and the R. And you can also have neither L nor R if it's neither left nor right associative. But this allows us to write it nicer like this. I think we will have all of these things in later lectures as well. So this is more supposed to be a whirlwind tour to show you get you a bit familiar with the code. Yes, so what I just did, I could have yet another definition for chain 2 using this new operator now. Okay. Then so now, I mean, earlier we had this function here with has block that checks whether the chain contains a block that equals X. Now let's say we don't just want to check blocks with a specific value, but blocks with a certain property. So for example, that has an even payload or an odd payload or anything. And we can model a property as a function of type payload int to bool. So now what we want, so basically instead of this has block, now we want, what is it called? Has block. Okay, fine. So has block prop. So it should take first a property and then a chain, and then tells me whether that chain contains a block where this property, this predicate is true. So in this case, the parentheses are needed because, as I said, the arrow associates to the right. So if I left them out, it would basically bracket this here, which is not what I want. So therefore, I need the arrows there. So let's write this. Of course, GitHub Copilot can write it for me. Okay, so but it's true, of course, what it says. So no matter what the property is, I don't care because the Genesis block has no blocks. I mean, there's in our implementation no payloads. So no matter what this predicate says, it's always false. I mean, this is supposed to mean there is a block with a payload with a given property. The Genesis block, there is no payload, so it's always false. And now, so if it's a block with C and N, then, I mean, earlier I checked whether it was N was the given, the X I was looking for. Now I just check whether the property holds. So I apply my predicate, my function from TXS tool to the given payload there, the N. And if that's true, it's good. Or and as before, I can also recursively, recursively go back. And we can try that out. So for example, has block prop even is, let's say, even is defined. So I can do even 24 is, ignore those. We come to why you get all these warnings later. So 24 is even and 25 is not. And now I can, for example, do has block prop even chain 2, and it's true because chain 2 has this 2 and this 4. But if I do odd, then it's false because all the payloads in chain 2 are even, so there is no odd one. And something like this that we just defined. Okay, right. And now let's say I want to check whether something has a block that's, I don't know, greater than 10. So of course, I mean, right. So let's say I want, instead of even or odd, I want to check whether there's a payload greater than 10. So the question is, what do I write here? I mean, there's no built-in function in Haskell greater 10. Of course, I could define one. I mean, I could write function greater 10 from into bool, and this. And I could reload, and then I can say greater 10 here. And it's false because there's only 2 and 4. So there is no greater 10. Fine. Now this is a bit tedious, is it that I have to define this function just for this one use case to use here at this point. Therefore, Haskell, and I mean, this is also these days common in TypeScript, JavaScript, almost every other language. Also a way to define functions without a name on the spot with a so-called lambda expression. And the syntax in Haskell is the lambda is just a backslash and then name of the argument. So let's say n greater than 10. So this defines a function without a name at this point that takes one argument, n, and the result is n greater 10. And if I do that, so that's exactly the same now as if I used my greater 10 that I explicitly defined. And I mean, if we do greater 3, then it's true because there were these blocks 2 and 4. So there is indeed one greater 3. So it does work. Right. So that's lambda expressions, anonymous functions. As I said, I mean, like 10 years ago, that might have been a big head twister or whatever in to teach this, but nowadays other languages also have these lambda expressions, just with a different syntax. I mean, in JavaScript, it's something like n3, I believe. Anyway, this is the Haskell syntax. And you can also define functions with several arguments when you put several here. So for example, I don't know, what can I define? Function that squares 2 arguments, squares them and adds them. So I could do something like x and y goes to x times x plus y times y. And I apply it to 3 and 4 and 25. 3 squared plus 4 squared, 9 plus 16 is 25. So it can have, these lambda expressions can have more than one argument as well. Right, it's this. So we saw this example, another. And in these cases, we can even write this, I mean, we can use currying. So we don't, in this case, we don't even need to use a lambda expression. We can also write this. So that's again the same. So this basically partially applies the greater function to 10. So if we ask for the type of greater, it's ignore this odd stuff. So it takes 2 arguments and returns a Boolean if the first is greater than the second. So greater 10, that's currying again, so partial application. I supply the first argument. So greater 10 is a function now that only takes 1 argument. So if I apply greater 10 to 20, it's sorry. To 20, it's true. If I apply 2, it's false. So I can even more compactly write this just like that. I could also, we had this, can also, for example, we earlier had this has block. I recover this has block in my has block prop if I just check whether there's a payload that equals 5. So there's none, but there is one that equals 4, and there is one that equals 2. So we see that with these lambda abstractions and with currying, it's often, I mean, you don't have to all the time name to things and define functions first just to use them and throw them away. Often very tersely and elegantly, you can on the spot find simple functions and use them. As I said, we will see many more examples. So this is just supposed to be a quick tour. And I'm afraid I also won't get through all the slides, I think. So but I mean, we started half an hour later, so I can't be helped, I'm afraid. There are also several ways. I mean, this is what we saw. So in order to define a function, we wrote different equations, one for each constructor of the type, in this case, chain. So we have many, many more examples how to define functions later. But there's also would be an alternative. We could, for example, also write this as a lambda. So we could say, okay, this is a function with 2 arguments. Once is prop, once is chain. Prop is this argument, that's that argument. And then instead of here these explicit equations for the pattern matching for the different cases, we can use the case keyword in Haskell. So case and then an expression of, and then basically you can pattern match. So in this case, chain is of type chain. So you can have your patterns in this way. Genesis block CT. And then the syntax is, instead of the equal sign that we know from here, case statement, there are arrows. So this is an explicit pattern match. So these pattern matchings can't only happen at top level when you do the equations. They can appear anyway in your code using this case statement. So this is just a different way to write the same thing. And we also see, now we have 3 examples of functions that operate on chains. And they are all very similar. We defined both of them with 2 equations. One equation for the Genesis block and one for the block constructor. And the second one with the block constructor tended to be recursive. So we are defining the function chain length, and in the second equation for block, we are using chain length again, the function we're just defining. Same for his block, same for his block prop. And that's no coincidence, because the block constructor was also recursive, because the first argument is C. And as we will see in the next lecture, this is a very common pattern in Haskell, that somehow the types and the functions that operate of those types, I mean, there's a very close relationship. If you have a recursive types, if you have type with 2 constructors where the second one is recursive, then functions operating on that type to have 2 equations where the second one is recursive. We'll see many, many, many examples of that in following lecture. But there's a close connection between the types you define or that are built in or that you use and the functions you write operating on those types. Let's see. As I said, this is all just an overview. We will go into detail with all these topics later. So this is just type inference. So how does the compiler figure out the type of this? So first of all, from the first equation, it knows it must be a function with 2 arguments. So it knows whatever the type looks like, it must be something like this. It doesn't yet know what the types of the arguments are and the result type, but just from the structure of this first equation, it already is obvious block prop must be a function with 2 arguments, because when we define it, we give it 2 arguments. Right. Now, inspecting the first equation, the right-hand side, false is of type bool. So we know the result type of this function we're defining must be bool. Right now, also looking at the second argument in the first equation, we see its genesis block, which we know is of type chain. So we know the second argument has to be of type chain. And finally, how do we now figure out what the first argument is, this prop? Well, if you look at the second equation, we know this logical OR operates two Booleans, so both sides must be Boolean. So in particular, prop t must be Boolean. And we see prop is a function because we apply it to one argument, to t. So we know prop is a function from one argument to bool. And finally, the t, no, because the block constructor takes a chain and an int or TXS. So we know that t is a TXS. So we know the argument of this prop function be TXS. So that shows how the compiler is able to, even if you don't provide a type signature, to figure out the types by itself. The Haskell type system has been designed very carefully such that this is always possible. So you never need a type signature in standard Haskell. The compiler would always be able to figure out all the types. However, we are not using standard Haskell. I mean, that was like Haskell 98. Also, I think without type classes. So like the bare bones, like the core of Haskell, you wouldn't need a single type application. All the types could be inferred by the compiler. But in practice, and especially with modern Haskell, which has evolved quite a lot and has added many more powerful features to a time system, but that also means that these days not everything can be inferred anymore by the compiler. So we will later see situations where you have to help the compiler by giving explicit signatures. But for standard Haskell, everything can be inferred automatically, which is also very powerful and unusual. So a lot of languages these days have type inference to a degree, but normally it's a bit ad hoc and depends, and you never know whether you need this type annotation or not. In Haskell, in principle, you never need one. What's this? Yeah, I think we should stop here now. I mean, there's still lots of slides. And I don't know, Robertino, what's your opinion? Does it make sense to already do the first exercises, or do we need something for that? Probably.
I mean, the exercises have the same order as the slides, so maybe they can work through it as up until where we covered it.
Yes. Are they already published, the exercises?
They have, the exercises are there, but we have to share the link, so we can share it like now if it makes sense. We can share it now and they can start working on it.
Okay. Yes. Okay. So because of this delay in the beginning, unfortunately, so now I don't get through with the lecture, but I think it's fine, and it's also important to, in my opinion, to be slow, especially in the beginning. So that's all good. But that just means that you can't do all the exercises already, but you can see how far you get. And I would recommend to really do them today or tomorrow before the next lecture. I think it's important to keep up. I mean, to stay up, to keep basically not get left behind by always trying to do the exercises immediately after the lecture before the next lecture. So yeah, please try them, and we will publish the link so that you can do them. And then on Wednesday, we'll continue with this and then dive into the next lecture, which will be about data types and functions, which is many, 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 many examples of what I just said, that the definition of types and the functions operating on those types have a very close relationship, which is this so-called standard design pattern in Haskell, which basically is important, and we will see a lot of examples. Okay, then I suppose we can stop here for now, except if there are any more questions. Okay, then thank you very much for your attention, and sorry about the technical problems at the beginning. No idea what's wrong with my Zoom, but I don't know. And so on Wednesday, do we try Zoom again, or do we immediately do Meet? I mean, I would be in favor of Meet because that always works for me. But are there any disadvantages of using Meet? I mean, we can record, and it seems all. I mean, there's also no limit on the participants. I don't know. We can still decide. Somebody says the link gives a form.
Why?
Yes, I think we need to publish the.
But that's the correct one, right?
Yeah, it's the correct.
Yes, yes. Okay. Okay, it's public now.
Okay.
Okay, now you should, if you try again, the 404 should go away.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Right. Then, yeah, good luck with your homework, and remember that you can ask questions also, I mean, until then on the social media channels, and then we talk again on Wednesday for the next lecture. Okay, then thank you very much. Also, thank you, Karina, Antonio, and Robertino, and talk to you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.